I'm Liz Neisloss. Tonight on Greater Boston, we'll dig into the latest investigative report from the GBH News series Trafficking, Inc. on forced labor in Massachusetts restaurants. Plus, Boston School Superintendent Mary Skipper's promising to overhaul the system's special education programs and root out racism. But some parents say they've heard these promises before. When we hear about human trafficking and slavery, the image of physical captivity may come to mind. But there are other forms of forced labor harder to identify and even more prevalent. That includes in the restaurant industry, as the GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting's series Trafficking, Inc. lays out. And cases have long gone underreported. Across the country and here in Massachusetts, restaurants top the list of industries with wage and hour violations, which, according to the report, can be symptoms of more severe exploitation. Award-winning investigative reporter and deputy investigative editor Jenifer McKim spoke to workers who described low wages, long hours, and an environment that made them too afraid to speak up out of fear of compromising their immigration status or losing their jobs. That includes Billy, who asked GBH to only use his nickname.
Permanece como escondido.
We remain hidden like prisoners in this country, he says, and I'm tired of being a prisoner.
Jenifer McKim, whose voice you just heard with Billy's translation, joins me now, along with Amy Farrell, professor at Northeastern School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and co-director of the Violence and Justice Research Lab. Thank you both for joining us. Jen, can we start with you? Explain what was Billy's story?
So Billy came to the United States from El Salvador, undocumented, about 15 years ago, started working in a restaurant in the what they call the back of the house, working as a dishwasher, earning $6 an hour, working 85 hours a week, no overtime, no breaks, no days off, no sick days. He said he worked and he worked and he worked like a slave. And he was too afraid to tell people or to ask for anything because he didn't have work authorization. So he kept this job because he felt like it was the only thing he could do for years and years until he finally realized that he could break out of it.
So a lot of the problems in the restaurant industry focus on wage violations. So let's look at some statistics that we have. The U.S. Department of Labor statistics on low wage and high violation cases in the U.S. in 2022. There were almost 4,000 cases. Back wages were owed more than $27 million, and more than 22,000 employees were impacted. Amy, can you tell us, is this only a piece of the abuse story?
Right. So issues around wage theft or wage violations are part of a puzzle that we see with workers that experience numerous violations at their work site, that work on a continuum from maybe lower level civil violations of the Fair Labor Standard Act to more severe violations that are of a civil nature, moving into more egregious violations that would be classified as criminal labor trafficking. And those are violations where the things that Jenifer describes in this piece, like low wages, sometimes dependence on housing, threats of immigration status being removed or deportation, unlawful use of the authorities of the law, keep a person coerced, forced, or defrauded to stay in a job. People are unable to leave bad jobs because of force, fraud, or coercion.
So the restaurant industry, I guess, seems to be very fertile ground. Why is that for this kind of abuse?
Right. And there are lots of industries, and I think the series goes in depth into numerous industries where there are lower levels of regulation, where there tend to be informal economies, where we tend not to be asking questions that we should be asking questions as consumers. And restaurants are one of those, where we have workplaces that oftentimes have high turnover, where you have people that are hidden from public view that work in the back of the house, where people who work may not speak English, and where there is an assumption that a family-owned restaurant is a happy place that everyone works, and you go there to enjoy a meal, and you feel like what you pay for your meal is probably paying a fair wage for workers, but we oftentimes have no idea what goes on behind the scenes, where individuals may be taking jobs where they're unable to leave those jobs, and they may be in fact suffering from either either civil labor abuses or labor trafficking.
So, Jen, a lot of victims are confused about this sort of crime. They know that they aren't getting the right wages, they're working long hours, but they are uncertain about the trafficking piece of it. Can you explain that confusion?
Well, I have to say that I think everybody is. Law enforcement, government officials. This is something that's really starting to sort of be discussed, and Amy Farrell is one of at the forefront of this discussion, but people have really, for a long, long time, didn't really realize that they were confused with wage and hour disputes and not considered trafficking. Sex trafficking, which is also a huge problem in the United States, is now better understood. Some say 20 years ahead of what we understand about labor trafficking.
And better prosecuted, I've heard.
Yeah.
Right. There's the vast majority of criminal prosecutions are related to sex trafficking, not labor trafficking. In fact, as part of our investigation, and the restaurant part is day 3 of our series, we found that there was a law passed in 2011 to create more prosecutions of human trafficking. And so far, there has not yet been one conviction in the labor trafficking arena.
Why is that?
There are a lot of different reasons, and I think Jenifer is really getting at this question about the fact that we have misperceptions about trafficking. It was fairly easy to convince law enforcement to look at sex trafficking. Commercial sex was already illegal. It was something that law enforcement was already doing. We sort of had a history of understanding that there could be violence within commercial sex industries. And so law enforcement gravitated to doing something that in many ways fit the profile of what law enforcement had traditionally done. I think law enforcement also had more public sympathy. The sex trafficking had more public sympathy, and so law enforcement followed along that sort of like public demand for them to look at commercial sex industries. Labor trafficking and labor violations isn't something that the police have traditionally handled. That has usually been inspectional services, the Department of Labor. It usually hasn't been a criminal violation. It's something we have fewer routines about handling. And when the public thinks about human trafficking, they have a perception of sex trafficking and not labor trafficking.
So where on the enforcement side does this need to be picked up? There's this confusion both on the victim side and on the law enforcement side about whether it's a wage issue, whether it's a trafficking issue. Where in the chain should this be picked up as trafficking?
I think it should be picked up in all places as trafficking. There's better education that's needed of the general public about the fact that things that happen to individuals in workplaces may in fact be violations, right? That there may be people harmed. And we have this sort of idea of work as something you need to struggle through, and something that as part of the American immigration experience, you probably needed to have terrible jobs and you needed to go through them and sort of earn your place as an American. And for individuals that may be insecurely housed or may take jobs where they're very vulnerable, I think we have very little sympathy for people that have to do that work.
Do you find that you hear that from victims? This is part of the struggle that I have to make to get.
Well, they kind of realize this is what, and Billy, for example, was like, I got this job. I just came here. I owed $18,000 that I paid to come to the United States. All I was trying to do was survive. And so he didn't really realize. And then he met some folks who were part of sort of the workers, centers, advocates, who told him that, no, in fact, you know, even if you don't have the right papers, they can't treat you like that. And he started to realize that he could fight back a little. So he left that first job, ended up with another bad job also, because then what other opportunities? So it is definitely a struggle.
And you mentioned a piece of this I'm quite curious about, which is the amount of money that a lot of trafficked people have to pay. They carry a debt, they have to pay it back. If they receive help, what happens to that debt? What happens to family that they may leave behind?
So even in cases of foreign national victims, and there can be both U.S. citizen victims and foreign national victims, and U.S. citizen labor trafficking victims are incredibly under-recognized, as are child labor trafficking victims. I just want to put that out there. But for foreign national victims that may come to the United States owing a debt, even if they receive a T visa, even if they receive assistance, even if a case is prosecuted, that smuggling debt is probably still owed.
And a T visa, we should explain, is a special visa that victims who prove substantial harm, I think, are given a special visa.
Yeah, and it's a visa that allows them to stay in the United States for a few years, and then, assuming all goes well, they can start the process of applying for a green card. But that doesn't erase the debt, right? So oftentimes families in home countries may still owe that debt. There still may be a situation where those individuals are threatened. And as Jenifer indicated, lots of individuals that even that receive T visas, may end up back in situations where they're vulnerable again because they're having to continue to pay off this debt that no one erases for them.
So tell us a little bit about the slice that most people don't imagine, which is trafficking within this country. I'm sure most people do think it's coming from another country, they're smuggled in.
Right.
What's going on within the country?
Right. So when we think about labor trafficking, I think we commonly do think about people that have, that were brought here that may owe a debt, that maybe have a visa or may not have a visa. But for U.S. citizens, we also find there are situations where individuals who have the same types of vulnerabilities, in the sense that they may have a criminal history that makes them difficult to receive employment, that an employer could hold that criminal history over them to keep them coerced into employment, that they may be in situations where they are insecurely housed, and so the employer provides an opportunity to have housing that's tied to their employment, and if they quit their job, they lose their housing. And there may be situations where individuals may have drug and alcohol dependency, and that is used coercively against them, either to make that known or to keep them in situations, whether we're talking about agricultural or restaurants, construction, domestic servitude. We see U.S. citizens involved in a wide range of situations where they're vulnerable to labor exploitation.
And what Amy says also about children is as ours is an ongoing series, and I hope that we continue to be looking into these things. And one of them is the area of trafficking with children, which we just don't understand with labor trafficking, and we're much more knowledgeable related to sex trafficking at this point. But there's issues related to young people who are perhaps involved with gangs, being forced to sell drugs. At this point, they've been more criminalized, and people are beginning to realize, wait, we need to change this language. They don't have agency, and they are also victims too.
So this is going to take a lot more money, of course, a lot more will on the part of, government officials. What do you think is needed to really dig into the problem?
And I think at the end of the day, we've approached this from the sort of the criminal prosecution, human trafficking angle. But what I see, there's a real possibility within the sort of worker rights angles. As we see more protection for workers generally, we have larger conversations about why restaurants can't reopen because we don't have staff in them, because people don't want to come back to work after the pandemic and work in places where there's sexual abuse or where there's low wages or where there's exploitation. So I think we tie this into a larger conversation about treating people fairly in workplaces, having monitoring and accountability in workplaces. I mean, oftentimes, labor trafficking victims may not necessarily want their perpetrators prosecuted, but they don't want it to happen anymore. They want to be able to work and earn a fair wage and provide for their family, and they don't want this to happen to other people. I don't know if the criminal justice system is always the right approach to this problem. It is definitely a problem about economic justice, that if we can tie into larger conversations about how we treat people in this country that are working, we may have more success.
And so we should say, though, Jen, that the Restaurant Association says it's unfair to link wage and hour violations to trafficking. What did you hear from them?
Right. So I had an email conversation with the head of the Massachusetts Restaurant Association, who did say it's unfair to link them, that these are often violations are, paperwork and issues that are not so large, and also that it's a real minority compared to the huge number of amazing restaurants in our state, which we all love to eat at. So at the same time, we spoke to advocates who say, I can hardly go out to eat because I just sit there and worry about who's in the back shop.
Well, this actually, we got 30 seconds left, but Amy, I want to hear from you. If you're a diner and you want to go out, you have no idea what's going in the, back of the house. Are there things that diners can do? Are there ways that they can understand what's happening in labor in a restaurant they go to?
I mean, there certainly are, in the sense that wage and hour violation data, H2A or H2B violation data is publicly available, and you can find out, in fact, the names of restaurants. You can be thinking about the fact there are cases in the state where we have wage and hour claims against restaurants, and we maybe don't patronize those restaurants. I think there's also the idea of getting to know the people that are working in restaurants, saying hello, being polite, actually asking questions of people, and treating other people like human beings that work in all places of the restaurant, not just your, wait staff, but everybody that you see in restaurants, and being vigilant about the fact that people may not be in a position where they can always ask for help.
Thank you. All right, Amy, Jen, we have to leave it there. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, it's no secret the Boston public school system has been struggling. It narrowly avoided a state takeover last year after the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education found it failed to meet a slew of goals set after the last state probe into the system. Among them, the department cited a lack of urgency in improving special education services. But now, Superintendent Mary Skipper, who took the helm of the BPS last year, is promising to make some sweeping changes. One of her main focuses, the district's long history of funneling Black and brown students into special education classes at much higher rates than their white peers. Superintendent Skipper recently told GBH, "There's no way I'm going to come in and be an effective superintendent and not deal with this straight up. So that's what I'm going to do." Joining me to discuss are Ruby Reyes, director of the Boston Education Justice Alliance, and Michael Krezmien, a professor of special education at UMass Amherst and the director for the school's Center for Youth Engagement. Ruby, you've heard promises before of help for the special education system. Can you boil down for us what the essential problem is that needs to be fixed from your perspective?
Well, I think most recently the Council of Great City Schools did another report on the things that could be fixed. Specifically, it almost mirrored what was written in 2009 in the 2009 report. So I think it's just a matter of, we're all kind of waiting for the proof in the pudding. As of right now, there's no pudding, there's no recipe, there isn't even a flavor chosen. And so I think for us, for myself, for many of our members, for families that have been in this process and heard these promises before, we're really frustrated and we're really at a very just really urgent state of needing some work to be done.
So, so let's look at some of the numbers that give people a little bit of the context for this. When you compare Boston and Massachusetts to the rest of the country, Boston's substantially separate rate, that's placing students in a substantially separate setting, and this is from a November 22 report by a nonprofit hired by the Boston Public Schools. Boston has a 29% rate, Massachusetts 14%, and the U.S. overall 13%. So, Michael, how do you explain these numbers? Does this seem striking to you? And you might really want to explain to people what substantially separate means for students.
Sure, yeah, it does seem striking. Substantially separate is an educational setting which has been removed from the access to the typical educational setting. So often these are segregated classrooms where students spend their day in an isolated classroom receiving instruction from special educators, or oftentimes separate schools, or often separate schools with specialized programs within them. And I would say that, to me, the biggest underlying kind of cause of high rates of kids in these settings is a failure of the educational system to effectively manage and educate the kids. So that the classroom settings are struggling, teachers are struggling, and instead of kind of revising the education, revising the curriculum, meeting the needs of those students, the easier option is to have them sent to another setting where they'll say this is a more specialized, environment that they can get better services and supports.
So, Michael, explain to people, what is it that they lose by being carved out of the regular classroom?
I think it's a wide sway of things that get lost. First, I think access to that general education curriculum from content, instructors. So a person who's trained to be a math teacher teaching you math. But I think it's also a removal from the social structures of school, that they don't get access to the same types of special programs that kids might get. They might not have art class or music class. And I think it's broad and sweeping. I think the students who are in these segregated settings have a vastly different experience. And to be honest, it's very difficult to reintegrate them without a really substantial plan for how they're going to meet the needs of these students in a typical education class.
So a particular aspect of Boston's public special education program impacts Black and Latino males. So let's look at some of the statistics that we have. Black males going into special education, 24%. Compared to their representation in the overall population of 14%. Latinos, 29% compared to their representation of 21%. And white students, 8% in special ed and very close match, 7% in the school system overall. Ruby, what does this say to you?
It says to me that Boston continues to have a legacy of institutional racism that it's historically had and historically has continued through policies, through placement of students, through, just throughout the entire system. I think the culture of the leadership and central office makes it difficult for families to have access to the resources that they need. And many times you see Black and Latino families being denied services or told, that they can't have certain things. And I think that's part of what makes it difficult for families to have access to the resources that they need for their children to be placed in the right settings.
So, Michael, can you explain how money is a part of this? Students, families with money can actually move to places where there's great special education. I've heard stories about lawyers who are hired by families to make sure that these individual educational programs, these sort of tailored programs to help their students, are done the right way. How does money play into all this?
Yeah, I think money and kind of sort of knowledge that can be obtained through some of the types of, elements you've just talked about, having an advocate who can help you, being able to hire an attorney who can walk you through the system. Special education is a very complex system, as Ruby points out. It's very difficult for parents to understand what's happening. There's not a lot of resources for parents to help them understand what is the best decision, what are the options available to us. And so you could imagine somebody who does have money and has the capacity to hire a special education advocacy attorney can get the services they need through that expertise, while others without those resources are left to sort of take what the district is providing and say, in an IEP process, it often is school and district dominated with relatively little voice from parents.
So you talk about the complexity of special education, Michael. Part of the assessment process to put a student into a special education program, it's somewhat subjective, really. It relies on the teacher. It can be impacted by bias. Can you explain how it is that it becomes a subjective process?
Yeah, I think there, especially when we're sort of talking about the problems that are being faced in a district like Boston, I think there's a range of issues going on. And I would say to start with, to sort of piggyback a little off of Ruby's point, I think that the education being provided to kids of color in their schools is not getting them up to the level that they need to be. And so these gaps in skills are misinterpreted as a disability, as opposed to we've failed to do our job in providing effective instruction. I think from that point on, there's we don't have a system that says here is the only way to identify a kid with a disability. It's a law that is pretty broad, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it doesn't give you here is the point-by-point steps that everybody follows. Instead, there's a lot of subjectivity. And just to point out, that law has not been reauthorized since 2004. So we're now talking about a law that sort of hasn't aged along with the ways that we can now measure student performance, the types of innovative assessments currently available to us.
And Ruby, there are a lot of students for whom English is a second language. How does that play into the problem?
Well, I think sometimes when a child, because they're supposed to offer native language literacy, and they don't necessarily do that as the beginning place, I think that's where students are misplaced. So they can be put into special ed, not realizing that it's just a matter of them needing to have English language literacy access. And so you see this this relationship between necessity and resources, and how important it is for families to know and be able to have access to that information. It's hard enough. We had one mother, for example, whose child needed door-to-door bus service because of a medical condition and had to obtain a lawyer to write a letter to get that simple thing. And so it is a difficult process. I think if you have, families whose first language is not English and aren't maybe as attuned to the complexities and understanding the complexities of accessing those resources in central office and navigating those spaces, it can be 2 and 3 times as hard.
We looked at the numbers that show the disproportionate numbers of Black students, Latino students, male students. Are there solutions, Ruby, that can be found to focus on these male students to better identify what is possibly a support that could be done in a classroom versus removing them from a classroom? Would having more teachers of color, more male teachers of color, be a help?
Absolutely. I think, the Garrity order calls for, which has never been met by the district or the city of Boston, calls for a 25% of Black teachers. I think there's not just a matter of hiring Black teachers, but really retaining them, making sure that they have the supports that they need. I would also say that we really pushed hard for ESSER funds to be put into hiring more reading specialists. A lot of times Black students and Latino students will have, reading needs.
Okay.
And those aren't necessarily being assessed.
All right. Thank you, Ruby. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Ruby, Michael, thank you both very much.
Thank you, and have a great day.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with Senator Elizabeth Warren on how she'll deal with the GOP threats on the debt limit, student loan forgiveness, crypto regulation, and her future political plans. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching. Good night.
For 500 years.